Here is a strange thing to sit with. We know more about Cleopatra than about almost any other woman of the ancient world. We know the political calculations behind her alliances, the languages she spoke, the way she dressed when she wanted to make an impression, the name of the physician who attended her in her final hours. Poets wrote about her within memory of her death. Historians recorded her words, or something close to her words, and their accounts have been copied and translated and argued over for 2,000 years. And yet, we do not know where she is. The woman whose name has never once dropped out of the Western imagination since the day she died in Alexandria in 30 BC has not been found. Her tomb is somewhere beneath the soil or the water of Egypt's Mediterranean coast. And despite 2,000 years of inquiry and more than a century of systematic archaeological effort, no one has opened the door. That absence, the gap between the intensity of her presence in the historical record and the completeness of her disappearance from the physical one, is one of the most quietly remarkable facts in all of ancient history. And it is where this story begins. Before we go further, if this is the kind of story that keeps you company at night, subscribing to the channel means the next one will find you when it is ready, without you having to go looking for it. There is genuinely no better company at this particular hour than history moving slowly through the dark toward a question that has been open for 2,000 years. Now let us begin. It is just before dawn on the Mediterranean coast west of Alexandria, and the sea is doing what the sea here does at that hour, arriving at the shore in long, shallow waves that carry almost no sound, only a soft, persistent pressure against the sand and the broken stone. The ruins begin a little way back from the waterline, half buried, the tops of old walls showing above the surface like the backs of sleeping animals, and the light, when it comes, will find them the color of the surrounding desert, because they have been here long enough to become the same material as everything around them. The air smells of salt and wet limestone and something older that has no name, and the only sound apart from the water is the occasional cry of a bird working the shoreline in the dark before the fishermen arrive. There is a particular quality to coastlines that have been inhabited for a very long time, a quality that has nothing to do with visible monuments or obvious antiquity, that is simply present in the way the land and the water relate to each other, in the worn smoothness of stone steps that lead down to a shore no one uses anymore, in the shallow depressions where buildings once stood that have been empty long enough for the ground inside them to grow its own vegetation, different from what grows outside, a slightly greener and more sheltered thing that marks the rectangle of what was there. You could walk this stretch of coast without knowing anything about it and still feel, in some way that resists precise articulation, that the ground had a great deal. It was not saying. What it is not saying, among other things, is where it put a queen. This is not a coast that looks like history. It is flat and bright in the daytime. The sea to the north, a particular shade of blue that shifts toward grey in the afternoon. The land behind it, sandy and low, broken by the occasional rise of a tell. The technical word for a mound of accumulated human debris that looks at first glance like a natural feature of the landscape. Tells are the characteristic landforms of the ancient Mediterranean and the ancient Near East, the visible residue of cities that were built, destroyed, built again on top of the ruins, destroyed again, and so on across centuries and sometimes millennia, until the accumulated debris of all those successive habitations became a small hill that later generations used for agriculture or grazing with uso. Particularly wondering why the soil was so rich and why broken pottery turned up every time anyone dug. The tells along this stretch of coast are low and unremarkable and almost entirely unexcavated, and somewhere in one of them, or beneath the water just offshore, or beneath the foundations of a building in the modern city behind us, is the reason you're here. Alexandria is not on the tell behind us. Alexandria is further east, a 45-minute drive along a coast road that runs close to the sea for most of its length. And Alexandria is one of those cities that it is very difficult to see clearly, because the idea of what it was has become so large and so bright that the actual city, which is a Mediterranean port of several million people with a tram system and a famous library that is not the original one, tends to disappear inside its own reputation. To approach Alexandria properly, it helps to put the reputation aside for a moment and think about the geography first. The city sits at the western edge of the Nile Delta, on a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean to the north and a large lagoon called Lake Mareotis to the south. A location that someone understood when the city was founded was one of the most advantageous pieces of geography in the known world. It had two natural harbors, access to both the sea and the Nile, and a position that placed it at the intersection of the Eastern Mediterranean's most important trade routes. The man who understood this and ordered the city built was Alexander the Great, who passed through Egypt in 31 BC. Roughly 3 centuries before Cleopatra was born, on his way to somewhere else, as he always was, he laid out the city's plan himself, reportedly tracing the lines of the major streets in flour on the ground because there was no chalk available, and he left almost immediately, never returning. By the time of his death 8 years later, the city bearing his name had barely begun to rise from the sand. It rose quickly once it started, the dynasty that inherited Egypt after Alexander's death. The Macedonian Greek family known as the Ptolemies made Alexandria their capital and poured into it the wealth of the Nile Valley, which was at that point the most productive agricultural territory in the world, a long ribbon of extraordinary fertility running through a desert that without the river would have been entirely uninhabitable. The Ptolemies built a royal quarter on the eastern harbor that occupied roughly a third of the entire city and contained palaces, temples, gardens, a zoo, a research institution known as the Mauseon, from which the word museum descends, and the library, which at its height may have held something in the range of 500,000 papyrus scrolls, making it by some considerable margin the largest collection of written knowledge in the ancient world. Ships arriving at Alexandria were reportedly boarded by officials who checked whether any texts on board were not yet in the library's collection, and if they were, the texts were copied and the copies returned to the ship while the originals stayed in Alexandria. This was the city into which Cleopatra VII was born in roughly 69 BC, the third child and eldest daughter of the reigning Ptolemaic king. Her full name was Cleopatra Philippa, which is Greek for Cleopatra, glory of her father, a name that carried a degree of dynastic freight that she spent her entire life either fulfilling or complicating, depending on your perspective. She was not, as centuries of painting and popular imagination have suggested, Egyptian in her ethnic origins. She was Greek and Macedonian, the descendant of a dynasty that had been ruling Egypt for nearly 3 centuries while remaining in its core identity as foreign to the country it governed as the Romans who would eventually replace it. What made Cleopatra different from every Ptolemy who had ruled before her, and different in a way that mattered enormously to the people she governed, was that she bothered to learn the language. The Ptolemies had been ruling Egypt since 305 BC, and not one of them, in all that time, had troubled to learn Egyptian. They governed through interpreters and administrators, conducted their religious rituals in a version of the form that satisfied the requirements without demanding genuine participation, and remained, in the most fundamental sense, visitors who had simply stayed too long to be asked to leave. Cleopatra changed this. Ancient sources report that she learned Egyptian, and also the language of the Ethiopians to the south, and the language of the Parthians to the east, and Aramaic and Hebrew, and the languages of several other peoples whose territories bordered or traded with Egypt, 9 languages in total, according to the account left by the Greek biographer Plutarch, who was writing about a century after her day, and drawing on sources that were, by his time, already beginning to become legend. What this meant in practice was that Cleopatra could address the priests of Egyptian temples in their own language, could speak directly to the farmers and merchants and soldiers of the Nile Valley, without the mediation of an interpreter standing between the queen and her people, translating everything and thereby owning, in a small but significant way, the meaning of what she said. It meant that when she performed the religious rituals that defined the Ptolemaic claim to legitimate rule over Egypt, the rituals in which the ruler appeared as a deity, as Isis or as the daughter of Ra, she was not simply going through motions whose content she didn't understand. She understood, and the Egyptians who watched understood that she understood, which was not a small thing. She was also, by all available accounts, exceptionally intelligent in the way that politicians who last tend to be intelligent, not in the abstract or theoretical sense, but in the immediate, practical, continuously attentive sense of someone who is always reading the room and always thinking 3 exchanges ahead. She had been navigating Ptolemaic dynastic politics since she was a child, and Ptolemaic dynastic politics was a field of study that required, among other things, a refined awareness of the circumstances in which a sibling might have you killed. Her father had been briefly deposed and spent time in exile in Rome, seeking Roman support to regain his throne, an experience that had given him, and presumably his daughter, a very clear picture of how completely the political world of the Mediterranean now orbited around the city on the Tiber. By the time Cleopatra was 18, her father was dead, and she was ruling Egypt jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, as the tradition of the dynasty required. Since Ptolemaic kings were expected to have a co-ruler, and the co-ruler was typically a sibling or a spouse, or in this dynasty's characteristically concentrated fashion, both. Her brother was 10 years old when they came to the throne, which meant that the joint rule was, in practice, her rule. But the advisors surrounding the young king were aware of this and began almost immediately working to change it. Within 3 years, she had been forced out of Alexandria entirely and was raising an army in Syria, preparing to retake her throne by force, when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, and the situation changed in ways that no one had anticipated. Caesar arrived in 48 BC, the year after Cleopatra had been driven from Alexandria, pursuing his defeated rival Pompey in the aftermath of the civil war that had remade Rome's political landscape. He came as a Roman general with a Roman army and a Roman sense of his own authority, and he came, in a political sense, at precisely the right moment for Cleopatra. The story of how she managed to arrange a meeting with him, smuggled into the palace in Alexandria, wrapped in a carpet or a cloth bag, according to the most famous account, is almost certainly embellished by the sources, but something like it may have happened, and what is certain is that the meeting took place and that its consequences were significant. Caesar supported her claim against her brother. The brief war that followed ended with Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while attempting to flee, and Cleopatra was restored to her throne with the backing of the most powerful man in the Roman world. That alliance lasted until Caesar's assassination in 44 BC. a blow that removed Cleopatra's protector and sent the Roman world into another round of civil conflict. She watched the convulsions from Egypt, assessed the contestants, and made the calculation that she had made before, the calculation that always shaped her relationship with Rome. Egypt could not defeat Rome militarily or politically, could not survive as an independent power by opposing Roman expansion, but might survive by making itself indispensable to the right Romans. The right Roman, after Caesar's death, appeared for a time to be Mark Antony. Antony was one of Caesar's most loyal generals and one of the three men who divided the Roman world between them in the immediate aftermath of the civil wars. The other two being Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and political heir, and Lepidus, who matters less to this story because he was eventually pushed aside. Antony's portion of the Roman world was the East, which meant that Egypt was his neighbor, which meant that he and Cleopatra were going to need to deal with each other sooner or later. They dealt with each other first in 41 BC, when Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at the city of Tarsus in what is now southern Turkey, and Cleopatra arrived on a barge that the sources describe with a specificity that suggests the spectacle was calculated to be remembered. Gilded stern, purple sails, silver oars, Cleopatra herself dressed as the goddess Aphrodite. The whole thing staged, with a careful attention to theatrical effect that characterized everything she did when she wanted to make a point. The point was that she was not coming as a supplicant. She was coming as an equal, or something very close to one. A queen with resources and territory and strategic value that Antony needed, and she intended the meeting to make that clear before a word had been exchanged. Whether Antony was charmed or impressed or simply recognized the quality of the intelligence he was dealing with. The meeting produced an alliance that lasted a decade and a half, produced 3 children, and eventually destroyed them both. For 15 years the alliance held, through the birth of twins, through Antony's politically necessary marriage to Octavian's sister, Octavia, through the donations of Alexandria in 34 BC, when Antony staged a ceremony in the city's gymnasium, distributing territories to his and Cleopatra's children in a manner that Octavian used with tremendous effectiveness as propaganda back in Rome. 2. Everything that the Roman world could throw at it. What it could not hold through was the Battle of Actium. By 31 BC, the year of the battle, the relationship between Antony and Octavian had passed beyond the point where negotiation or political compromise was going to resolve it. One of them was going to rule Rome. One of them was going to be the last thing standing. They met, if that's the word for it, off the coast of northwestern Greece at a headland called Actium in a naval engagement on the 2nd of September that the sources present as a disaster for Antony's side, though the reality was probably more complicated and more ambiguous than the later Roman narrative which was written by the winners would suggest. What is clear is that Cleopatra's fleet left the battle, that Antony followed, and that the combined force that had been their best and perhaps their only hope of matching Octavian did not prevail. She was 38 years old when her fleet turned north from Actium and headed back toward Alexandria. She had ruled Egypt for nearly 20 years, had navigated the most dangerous political environment in the ancient world, had kept her kingdom independent while everything around it was absorbed into Rome, and she was sailing home to a city that she already knew with the clarity of a very intelligent person who was run out of moves, was not going to remain hers for long. The harbour at Alexandria in the late days of summer, in the year that would become the last year of the world Cleopatra had known, was a harbour that had seen a great deal and had learned over the centuries to keep its own counsel about what it observed. Ships came and went from it daily, the ordinary traffic of one of the busiest ports in the ancient world. merchant vessels from every coast of the Mediterranean and from further east, grain barges working the canal that connected the harbour to the Nile Delta, fishing boats returning before dawn with whatever the night had given them, naval vessels in peacetime moving between Alexandria and the Ort, a port of Egypt's coastline. But in the late summer of 31 BC, the fleet that came back into the eastern harbour was not the fleet that had left, and what it carried with it, invisible but present in the way that catastrophic news always arrives before anyone speaks it aloud, was the knowledge that the last serious challenge to Octavian's control of the Roman world had ended, and had not ended well. The Battle of Actium, fought on the 2nd of September off the northwestern coast of Greece, was not a battle that Cleopatra had planned to lose. Very little that Cleopatra planned had been planned to fail. She had spent her entire adult life, from the moment she was old enough to understand what kind of world she had been born into, constructing strategies that allowed her to maintain her position and her kingdom against odds that were, from the beginning, not in her favor. A small kingdom at the eastern edge of a Mediterranean world increasingly dominated by a single city, a dynasty whose legitimacy depended on performing two completely different sets of royal identities simultaneously. A situation in which the primary external threat, Rome, was large enough and confident enough to simply absorb Egypt whenever it decided the complications of dealing with an independent Egyptian royal house were no longer worth the minor benefits of the arrangement. Cleopatra had kept all of this in balance for nearly 2 decades by making herself and her resources indispensable to the Romans she aligned herself with. At Actium, the balance tipped, and it did not tip back. The accounts of the battle itself are frustratingly partial, written by historians who were drawing on sources that were, in many cases, written by people with strong reasons to present what happened as a decisive Roman triumph, rather than a complicated naval engagement whose outcome was less clear-cut than the subsequent narrative suggested. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the battle was fought as a naval engagement, that Antony's land forces were in considerable disarray by the time it began, because months of blockade had depleted his supplies and encouraged significant numbers of his allies and officers to defect to Octavian's side, and that at some point during the fighting, Cleopatra's ships broke through the Blanry, occurred and headed south toward Egypt. Antony followed, leaving the rest of his fleet. Whether this was a planned maneuver that failed, or a retreat, or something else that the available sources don't give us the language to describe precisely, is not something we can say with certainty. What we can say is that the combined force that represented their best hope did not prevail, and that by the time the fleet reached Alexandria, the political situation in the eastern Mediterranean had been fundamentally and irreversibly altered. The situation Antony and Cleopatra had arrived at by the autumn of 31 BC was not one they had failed to anticipate entirely. The months before Actium had already shown the shape of things. Defections among Antony's officers and allies, supply shortages caused by Octavian's naval blockade, the gradual erosion of the coalition they had spent years assembling. Kings and client rulers who had pledged their support had been reassessing that pledge since it became clear which way the wind was blowing in the Roman world, and the wind had been blowing toward Octavian for longer than Antony's public position had admitted. The battle itself, when it came, was almost the final act of a process that had been completing itself for months. Cleopatra would have known this before she arrived home. She was not a person who avoided difficult assessments of her own situation, and the assessment of this situation, while it could be approached from several angles, kept arriving at the same conclusion. Octavian had won. The question was not whether he would come to Egypt, because he would, but what he would do when he arrived, and whether there was anything she could do in the time remaining to effect the answer to that question. She was 38 years old. She had been a queen since she was 18, and she understood power and the people who exercised it with the particular clarity of someone who has spent her entire conscious life in the room where decisions are made. She began, in the weeks between Actium and Octavian's arrival, to pursue what options remained. The time between the defeat and Octavian's arrival was perhaps 6 or 7 months. Not long in absolute terms, but long enough, if you were Cleopatra, to explore every possibility that the situation still contained. She opened negotiations with Octavian, sending messages and gifts, trying to establish whether there was any arrangement under which she might retain some form of power in Egypt, or at least secure the succession of her children. She sent her son Caesarion. The boy she maintained was Julius Caesar's child, and who therefore had a dynastic claim on Rome that Octavian would certainly find inconvenient. South toward the Red Sea and potentially India, with a substantial escort and instructions that suggest she was trying to get him beyond Octavian's reach. She also, according to several ancient sources, began work on a monument, a mausoleum, that she had apparently been planning for some time, and which she now began to provision and fortify as something that could serve as a refuge if everything else failed. In the weeks of negotiation and preparation, she also had to manage the situation of Caesarion, the son she had named as Caesar's heir, who at 17 was old enough to be a dynastic problem for Octavian, and young enough to be managed if he could be moved beyond Octavian's immediate reach. She sent him south, toward the Red Sea port of Berenice and potentially beyond, with a substantial escort and enough resources to establish himself somewhere that Rome's reach had not yet firmly extended. The plan did not succeed. Caesarion would be captured and killed not long after Cleopatra's death, on Octavian's orders, on the practical grounds that there could only be one person claiming descent from Julius Caesar at a time, and Octavian already occupied that position. But Cleopatra's attempt to protect him is worth noting, not because it succeeded, but because it shows her still acting, still trying to find the angle that hadn't yet been closed off in the last weeks of her life when most of the angles were already gone. The ancient sources are not entirely consistent about the mausoleum's location, which is one of the reasons why finding Cleopatra's tomb has proven so difficult. But they agree that it was near or attached to a temple precinct, probably in the royal quarter of Alexandria, and that Cleopatra spent considerable time there in the final weeks before Octavian's arrival. She moved gold and treasure into it. She moved herself into it, or at least spent significant time there. And when Antony's situation became untenable, when his troops had surrendered and his army had dissolved and there was nothing left of the force they had built together, she retreated inside and sealed the doors. There is a passage in Plutarch's account of Antony's last days that is one of the strangest and most affecting passages in ancient biography, precisely because of the clarity with which it shows a person making a terrible mistake under the worst possible circumstances. Antony, retreating toward the mausoleum after his forces had abandoned him, received a message, or perhaps a rumor, possibly deliberately sent by Cleopatra herself, though the sources are not clear on this point, that Cleopatra was dead, that she had already died inside the mausoleum. Antony, hearing this, fell on his sword. He did not die immediately, and what followed, according to Plutarch, was a scene of considerable anguish. Antony dying and asking to be carried to the mausoleum, Cleopatra and her attendants unable to open the main door, and lowering ropes or sheets from an upper window to haul him up, the Roman general dying in the arms of the woman he had, in the end, followed to this outcome. We do not know whether Plutarch's account is accurate in its details. He was writing more than a century after the event, and his sources for these intimate scenes were necessarily at several removes from what actually happened. But the broad outlines, that Antony died by his own hand, believing Cleopatra was already gone, and that he died near the mausoleum and in her presence, are consistent across the ancient sources that survive, which suggests they derive from something like a genuine account of the day. What is worth sitting with for a moment, before the story moves forward, is what this sequence of events reveals about the situation Cleopatra was in. The message about her death, whether she sent it deliberately or whether Antony received a garbled version of something else, suggests that she was already thinking, even in those final days, about how the story would be told. If Antony believed she was dead, and if he killed himself on receiving that information, then she had demonstrated to Octavian, or could at least attempt to argue, that Antony's decision to die was his own, that it was not the result of Roman forces having killed him in battle, which might create various complications, but the consequence of his own despair. This may be reading too much strategy into what was, in the immediate experience, a catastrophic and grief-filled series of hours. But Cleopatra, thinking about narrative and presentation, even at the worst moments, is entirely consistent with everything the sources tell us about her. Octavian arrived at Alexandria in early August of 30 BC, roughly a year after Actium. His arrival was, by the standards of Roman military campaigns, relatively orderly. There was no significant resistance. The Egyptian military forces that had been loyal to Cleopatra and Antony had either dispersed or surrendered, and Alexandria opened its gates without the kind of dramatic siege that had accompanied some of Rome's other territorial acquisitions. Octavian entered the city and went, apparently fairly quickly, to see two things. The body of Alexander the Great, which was kept in a famous golden tomb in the city, and which Octavian reportedly treated with considerable reverence, accidentally breaking off the dead king's nose during his inspection, and Cleopatra, who was still inside the mausoleum. Octavian was 32 years old when he entered Alexandria, not much older than Cleopatra had been when she first became queen, and he had been at war, in one form or another, for most of the preceding decade. He was not a military man in the way that Caesar or Antony had been military men, not someone who led from the front or was known for personal courage in battle, but he had proven himself something more durable than a battlefield general, a political strategist of considerable sophistication, a man who understood how to accumulate power and how to maintain it, and who had an instinct for narrative that would eventually shape the way the Roman world understood itself for centuries. He came to Alexandria not simply to secure a territory, but to complete a story, and the story he was completing required a particular ending. The meeting between Octavian and Cleopatra is reported in the ancient sources in considerable detail, which means that some of the detail is almost certainly invented or embellished, and that separating what genuinely happened from what made a good story is not entirely possible. What the sources agree on is that Cleopatra attempted, in some form, to negotiate, that she was eloquent and composed, that Octavian was, in his response to her, careful and non-committal, which Cleopatra apparently interpreted or attempted to interpret as a sign that some arrangement might still be possible. The ancient sources also suggest that she had, by this point, information or a strong belief that Octavian intended to take her to Rome to display in his triumph, which was precisely the outcome she had been working to prevent for the past year. Whether she learned this from a message or from reading Octavian's manner in their meeting, or from some other source, the sources don't tell us clearly. There is a detail in some of the ancient accounts that is worth dwelling on, because it says something about the kind of person Cleopatra was, even in extremis. She reportedly sent a message to Octavian after their meeting and in the days that followed, saying that she wished to be buried with Antony and asking for his permission for this. Whether this was genuine grief or a calculated appeal to his sense of the appropriate, or both, is impossible to know. What we do know is that Octavian, who had every reason to refuse any request from a woman he had just defeated and who had been his enemy for a decade, apparently gave some indication that the burial together would be permitted. Whether he intended to honor that indication, whether it was simply a way of keeping Cleopatra calm while he made his arrangements, is one of the questions the sources cannot answer. What they tell us next is that she died 12 days after Antony's death in the mausoleum, under circumstances that ancient authors describe with great care and some discrepancy. The most famous version, which derives ultimately from Plutarch's account and which has become the image most familiar to subsequent centuries, involves a basket of figs in which an asp, a small Egyptian cobra, had been concealed. The snake's bite providing a death was both suicide and, in Egyptian religious symbolism, something considerably more complex than simple self-destruction. The cobra was the symbol of Egyptian royal authority, worn on the crown as the uraeus, the divine serpent that protected the pharaoh and that was itself an embodiment of the goddess Watjet, one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian tradition. To die by the cobra's bite was, in this reading, not merely to choose death over captivity, but to die as a queen of Egypt in the full performance of what that meant. We do not know whether the asp story is true. We do not know whether Cleopatra died by snakebite or by poison carried in a comb or a hairpin, which are the other versions the ancient sources offer, or by some other means. Ancient physicians apparently examined her body and found no obvious wound, which the sources cite as evidence for the snake theory, though the examination itself may not have been as rigorous as this implies. What we know is that she died by her own choice before Octavian's triumph could use her as its centerpiece, that she was approximately 39 years old, and that what happened to her body after that, the location of the tomb, the nature of the burial, the question of whether Antony was laid beside her, as the ancient sources suggest Octavian permitted, is the mystery at the heart of this story, and the question that 2,000 years of subsequent history have not yet answered. She had spent her entire adult life finding angles that other people had not seen, exits that had not appeared to exist until she made them. Now there was only one exit remaining, and she approached it with the same deliberate attention she had brought to everything else. The question was not whether she would die on her own terms. The question was what those terms would mean to the people who came after. And that is where we leave the harbor and the retreating fleet, the summer of 31 BC, closing around a city that still stood but already knew what was coming. We can move forward now, a few weeks, into the late summer heat of Alexandria, in the final days of August 30 BC, when Cleopatra had barricaded herself inside the mausoleum she had been preparing, and Octavian's patience with the situation had nearly run out. What happened in those last days is one of the most carefully observed deaths in the ancient world, recorded by people who were not there, but who had access to people who were, and what it tells us about Cleopatra is, in the end, the most important thing the historical record preserves. The mausoleum had been under construction for some time before Actium. This is one of the details in the ancient sources that tends to get less attention than it deserves, because it suggests something significant about how Cleopatra was thinking in the months leading up to the battle. that she was already making provision for the possibility that the battle would not go as she hoped, already planning the circumstances of her death with the same careful attention she had always brought to the management of her reign. The building was located near a temple of Isis, the goddess with whom the Ptolemaic queens had long identified themselves and whom Cleopatra had specifically cultivated throughout her rule, and it was substantial enough to serve not merely as a burial chamber, but as a final stronghold, a place where Cleopatra could withdraw and from which she could conduct her last negotiations. After the fall of Antony's cause and the disintegration of his army and support in Egypt's eastern territories, Cleopatra retreated to the mausoleum with her most trusted attendants and with a portion of the royal treasury. This is another detail worth sitting with. She brought the treasury. Ancient sources are specific on this point, noting that Cleopatra had gathered gold and silver and precious stones and a considerable quantity of material that could be burned, and that she had communicated to Octavian her intention to burn everything she had brought with her if his approach became too threatening. The message was clear enough. Octavian needed the Egyptian treasury to fund the new order he was building. If he pushed too hard, he would get nothing. In the months between Actium and her retreat to the mausoleum, Cleopatra had not been idle. She had sent her eldest children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and the younger Ptolemy Philadelphus, toward the east with a substantial escort, exploring the possibility of some kind of refuge beyond Octavian's reach. She had attempted, through intermediaries, to negotiate with Octavian directly, sending messages that proposed various terms of surrender that would allow her to retain some form of autonomy, or at least to secure the succession of her children to some portion of her former territories. She had also, and this is the detail that speaks most clearly to her practical intelligence, been very careful about which of her advisors and which of Antony's former supporters she allowed near her during this period, aware that in the collapsing world around her, the people closest to her were the people most likely to be approached by Octavian's agents with offers that might prove difficult. Refuse. It was a negotiating position, and a genuinely clever one, but it was operating in a context where Cleopatra's leverage had become very limited. Octavian sent envoys. She received them through a window in the mausoleum's upper stories, since she had sealed the doors and was not going to open them to anyone she didn't entirely trust, and the conversations these envoys reported back suggest that she was testing the possibilities with the same precision she had always brought to political negotiation, trying to understand what Octavian actually wanted, whether the was any version of survival available to her that would not require her to be displayed in chains in Rome. The ancient sources give us, through Plutarch's biography of Antony and through Cassius Dio's history of Rome, a remarkably detailed account of the weeks between Actium and Cleopatra's death, detailed in ways that make historians careful about accepting all of it as straightforwardly factual. The detail is so rich that it invites suspicion. Some of it was clearly shaped by the political interests of the Augustan era in which it was first written down, and some of it has the quality of being too perfectly theatrical to be entirely reliable. But the broad outlines are consistent across sources that drew on different traditions, and the broad outlines tell a story that is, when you set aside the theatrical embellishments, entirely coherent with what we know of Cleopatra's character and situation. What the sources tell us is that Antony died first. He'd been fighting a rearguard action against Octavian's advancing forces while Cleopatra was in the mausoleum. And when he received what was apparently a false report that Cleopatra was already dead, he responded by falling on his sword in the manner that Roman military tradition associated with an honorable death in defeat. He did not die immediately. He was carried, still alive, to the mausoleum, where Cleopatra and her attendants pulled him up through a window, because she would not open the doors, and he died in her presence, according to Plutarch's account, with something like the intimacy of a private rather than a public ending. The detail about pulling him through the window, Cleopatra and two women hauling a dying man upward with ropes and ribbons, her arms straining, blood on the sill of the opening, is one of those images from the ancient sources that lodges in the mind and refuses to dislodge. It may not be precisely accurate, but it has the texture of a story told by someone who had access to someone who was there, or who thought they were, and its specificity makes it feel different from the purely literary elaborations that surround it. Whether it happened precisely that way or not, Antony died in the mausoleum, or close to it, and Cleopatra was present when he died. How Cleopatra bore Antony's death is something the sources touch on without dwelling on. What they emphasize instead is her behavior in the days and hours that followed, and what they emphasize is composed, deliberate, controlled. She did not collapse. She asked for Octavian to allow her to conduct burial rites for Antony, and Octavian permitted this, and the sources describe her tending to the body herself, which in the Egyptian funerary tradition was a ritual act of considerable significance, the kind of physical care for the dead that signaled not merely grief, but a specific kind of religious claim to the relationship between the living and the departed. Whether Cleopatra was performing this act for Antony or for the benefit of the Egyptian witnesses who would carry the account of it forward, or both, is something we cannot say. The performance and the feeling were, in her life, as in most lives, not entirely separate things. After the burial rites, she became ill. The sources describe a period of illness following Antony's death and the burial, during which Cleopatra refused food and apparently attempted to starve herself before Octavian's people intervened with a combination of threats and persuasion. The nature of the illness is described differently in different sources. Some suggest it was grief, a genuine physical prostration in response to loss. Others suggest it was strategic, another attempt to control the terms of her situation by making herself appear too unwell to be moved or displayed. The truth may be both of these things simultaneously, since grief and strategy were not, for Cleopatra, mutually exclusive categories. It was after Antony's death that Octavian made his move on the mausoleum itself. He sent his man Proculius, the name appears in Plutarch and in Cassius Dio, both, with orders to secure Cleopatra alive if at all possible. Cleopatra apparently trusted Proculius enough to speak with him through the sealed doors, or perhaps through the same upper window that had admitted Antony and the envoys. And while she was speaking with him, another of Octavian's men, in some accounts named Gallus, entered through the upper level by a ladder. Cleopatra saw or heard him coming and drew a dagger to kill herself. Proculius or one of his companions restrained her before she could do it. She was taken alive. This was what Octavian had wanted. And now the negotiation entered its final phase. She knew what being taken alive meant: Octavian's triumph. The ceremonial procession through Rome in which a victorious general displayed his most significant prisoners to the Roman people before their execution or permanent imprisonment would have been the culmination of the war he had just won, and Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt and the partner of his great rival, would have been its centerpiece. Roman triumphs had in the past included effigies or painted representations of rulers who had died before they could be displayed in person, so even death was not necessarily going to protect her from some form of posthumous public humiliation. But being alive and in his power was the thing she most needed to prevent. The weeks that followed her capture were, from her perspective, a continuation of the same negotiation she had always been conducting. The same attempt to find the angle that was not yet visible. The same effort to understand the constraints of the situation well enough to work within them or around them. What happened in the weeks between her capture and her death is, in many ways, the most interesting part of the story, and also the part where the ancient sources are most clearly shaped by political considerations. Octavian visited her in person, a meeting that Plutarch describes with a great deal of theatrical detail. Cleopatra in a state of deliberate, managed disarray, manipulating the presentation of herself even in captivity, with the instinct of someone for whom the management of appearances had been a tool of governance for 20 years. The sources differ on what was said and what was agreed. What is not in doubt is the outcome. She died in early August of 30 BC, in the 10th month of Octavian's occupation of Egypt, and approximately 11 days before Octavian formally declared the country a Roman province. She was 39 years old. The method of her death is the most famous detail in a story full of famous details, and it is also the one where the ancient sources are most notoriously unreliable. The image of the asp, the Egyptian cobra, brought to her in a basket of figs and applied to her arm or her breast depending on which source you consult, is so thoroughly embedded in the cultural memory of her death that it functions less as a historical claim than as an icon, a symbol whose meaning has been built up and refined over 2,000 years of artistic and literary elaboration. The asp story appears in the sources, but it appears alongside genuine uncertainty. Plutarch writes that no one knew exactly how she died. He notes that small marks were found on her arm, consistent with a bite, but also notes that whether those marks were from a snake or from some other cause was not definitively established. Cassius Dio mentions the snake, but also mentions the possibility that she used a pin or a needle. Strabo, writing closer in time to the events, is less specific and more cautious. What the sources agree on is that she died by her own hand, in the mausoleum, attended by her women, 2 of whom died with her. What they disagree on is the mechanism, and on this question we cannot say with certainty what happened. We may never be able to say. What we can say is that when Octavian's people opened the mausoleum after her death, they found her composed and prepared, dressed in her royal regalia, laid out as though for a formal viewing rather than simply collapsed. This is consistent with everything the sources tell us about her management of the circumstances of her death, that she had planned it, had chosen the manner and the timing and the presentation, had refused to leave that final decision to her conqueror. Whether the method was the famous snake or something else, the outcome was what she had arranged for it to be. The question of what Octavian did with her body is where the trail begins to go cold. Ancient sources record that he permitted her burial and that he permitted Antony to be buried beside her, and that the burial was conducted with the honors appropriate to a queen. Plutarch gives us this. Cassius Dio confirms the general outline. The specific location is not recorded, or, if it was recorded, the record has not survived in any form that modern scholarship can read as a reliable map. Octavian proceeded, after the burials, to erase everything he could reach of the world that Cleopatra and Antony had built. He killed Cleopatra's son Caesarion, the child she had with Julius Caesar, because Caesarion was old enough and connected enough to serve as a rallying point for anyone who wanted to challenge the new Roman order in Egypt. He had the statues of Antony destroyed. He did not, notably, have the statues of Cleopatra destroyed, a decision whose motivation has been debated ever since, though the most likely explanation seems to be that the Alexandrians threatened to pull down their own buildings if he touched them, and that the negotiation involved a kind of informal immunity for her image in stone. Her image in the city, then, survived. The city itself survived for a time in the form Cleopatra had known it. But the specific location of the royal mausoleum, the place where the last Ptolemaic ruler was buried with the Roman general who had chosen her world over his own, was not preserved in any record that reached the modern era. The ancient city of Alexandria was already changing shape within a generation of Cleopatra's death, its royal quarter repurposed by Roman administrators who had no particular interest in maintaining the symbolic geography of the Ptolemaic world, and within a few centuries the precise location of most of the landmarks that had defined the city's identity, including the Great Library, the Mausoleum, the tomb of Alexander himself, had been lost to practical knowledge even as they continued to exist in literary memory. There is an important distinction between those two kinds of knowledge: literary memory and practical knowledge. Literary memory is what you find in books, in the surviving accounts that tell you something existed and roughly where it was, in relation to other things that also no longer exist. Practical knowledge is what you need to actually find it, the specific coordinates, the precise relationship to landmarks that are still present, the kind of local continuous knowledge that is maintained by communities who care about a place across generations. Cleopatra's tomb had literary memory. The sources remembered it, referred to it, described its general location in terms that assumed a reader who could look out a window and see what they were describing. What it lost, sometime in the centuries following her death, was practical knowledge. And once practical knowledge is lost in a city as dynamic and disaster-prone as Alexandria, it is very difficult to recover. The city that grew up above the Ptolemaic city had no particular reason to preserve the geography of what lay beneath it. The Ptolemaic royal quarter was replaced by Roman administrative buildings, which were in turn modified by Byzantine construction, which was in turn altered by Arab occupation in the 7th century, which eventually produced the modern city that now sits atop all the previous layers in the manner of a very large and very complicated tell. To find Cleopatra's tomb in Alexandria would require either an extraordinary stroke of luck in the form of a new construction project accidentally exposing exactly the right layer, or a systematic program of excavation that would require demolishing significant portions of a functioning modern city, which is neither practical nor, in most cases, ethically acceptable. Octavian had wanted her alive for his triumph. He had settled instead for something more durable, the story which he could shape. He permitted her burial, permitted Antony's body to lie beside hers, and then proceeded to erase everything else he could reach. What he could not erase, it turned out, was the absence. The missing tomb became, in its own way, a form of permanence that not even Rome could undo. And that is where we leave the mausoleum and the sealed doors, the story of the death and the burial reaching its end in a room that no one has opened since, in a location that the sources preserve only in the vaguest terms. We can move forward now, stepping away from the immediate aftermath of 30 BC and out across the centuries that followed, watching what happened to the city that held the tomb even as the tomb itself passed out of all known record. What the city underwent in the 2,000 years between Cleopatra's death and the present day is the reason the search is so difficult, and understanding that transformation is essential to understanding why no one has yet found what they are looking for. Alexandria, in the years immediately following Octavian's takeover, was still, in most of the ways that counted, the city Cleopatra had known. Its physical fabric had not been substantially altered. The lighthouse still stood at the entrance to the eastern harbor, its fire visible on a clear night from many kilometers out to sea. The Mausoleum still functioned as a center of scholarship. its roles preserved and its scholars still working. The palaces of the royal quarter still occupied their promontory on the eastern harbour, now repurposed as the residence of Roman prefects rather than Ptolemaic kings, but still standing, still intact. The royal necropolis, the complex of tombs in which the Ptolemaic rulers had been buried across the preceding 3 centuries, was presumably still accessible, at least to those with reason to access it, and Cleopatra's mausoleum, wherever it stood in relation to the necropolis, had presumably been sealed and left in whatever condition it was in after the burial. What began to change the city was not conquest or deliberate destruction, but the slower, less dramatic forces of geological time and administrative neglect. Alexandria was built on what is technically called a subsiding coastline. The land beneath it was, and continues to be, very slowly sinking, and it was built at an elevation that gave it very little margin for error. The combination of tectonic subsidence, the gradual compaction of the delta sediments on which the city rested, and the slow rise of sea levels over the centuries meant that the parts of the city closest to the water were perpetually at risk from flooding, and that any significant seismic event could, and periodically did, send portions of the city permanently below the waterline. It is worth pausing here to think about what the disappearance of a city actually looks like from the inside, from the perspective of the people living through it. No generation of Alexandrians woke up one morning and decided that their city was going to slip into the sea. What they experienced instead was a series of discrete events, some dramatic and some gradual, each of which was managed and responded to as best as the circumstances allowed, none of which was understood at the time as part of a larger pattern of permanent transformation. A flood damages the lower city. Buildings are repaired or rebuilt on slightly higher ground. A decade passes. Another flood, slightly worse this time. More buildings shifted or abandoned. Then an earthquake, the aftershocks going on for weeks, and sections of the coastline that had been dry land are now, when the water recedes, lower than they were before, close enough to the sea level that the next flood will not fully recede. The sea claims a meter of the waterfront, then another meter. Over 3 or 4 centuries, this adds up to a substantial rearrangement of the relationship between the city and the water, and by the time it has happened, no one alive has any memory of what the city looked like before it began. The earthquakes came. They came in the 4th century and the 8th century, and at various points in between and afterward, and each significant seismic event pushed more of the low-lying parts of the city, the harbour areas and the royal quarter on its promontory, closer to or beyond the boundary between land and water. The geologist and underwater archaeologist Frank Goddeau, who has spent decades mapping the submerged areas of Alexandria's ancient harbour, has documented the results. A substantial portion of what was once dry land in the ancient city, including areas that the ancient sources place in or near the royal quarter, now lies under several meters of water in the eastern harbour. The famous lighthouse island of Pharos, which in Cleopatra's time was connected to the mainland by an artificial causeway, is now mostly submerged, its massive stone blocks resting on the seafloor alongside column capitals and statue fragments, and the scattered architectural remains of buildings whose names we know from ancient descriptions, but whose physical forms we cannot fully reconstruct. A diver descending through the green harbour water of modern Alexandria, passing through the shallow layer of visibility near the surface and into the dimmer water below, will find her hand passing over a column capital resting on the seafloor at a depth of 6 meters. Its carved acanthus leaves, still sharp, still recognizable, still as detailed as the day they were cut by a craftsman working in a workshop in the ancient city perhaps 2,200 years ago. The stone has not degraded in the way that organic material degrades. It has simply moved from air to water, from accessibility to inaccessibility, from the visible world to the invisible one. If you knew nothing else about what lay below you, the capital alone would tell you that something significant had stood here, that the water covered a city rather than a plain. What it cannot tell you, what the seafloor in its entirety cannot tell you without a great deal of careful additional investigation, is exactly which city. Alexandria's harbour bottom contains material from multiple periods of occupation. Architectural fragments from the Ptolemaic era mixed with Roman construction and Byzantine modification, and the accumulated debris of centuries of harbour activity. Fishing weights and amphora fragments and ship timbers and the miscellaneous residue of a working port. To identify a specific Ptolemaic structure in this context, to say with confidence that this set of stones belonged to this building described in this ancient text, requires the kind of painstaking cross-referencing of physical evidence and documentary evidence that the French archaeological team working under Godoy has been conducting since the early 1990s, and which has produced remarkable results without yet producing the one result that everyone working in this field is most aware of the absence of. The harbour floor today is, in its own way, a kind of slow-motion archive. Things fell in and stayed. For 2,000 years the water held what the land had given up, and it holds it still, patient and cold and dark and in its own way extraordinarily well preserved. Objects that fell or were thrown into the water at various points across 2,000 years have been preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the sediment in ways that objects exposed to air are not, and the material recovered from Godio's excavations includes not only architectural fragments but coins, ceramic objects, jewelry, and the kinds of small personal items that never make it into the historical record, because they were too ordinary to be worth noting when they were in common use. A bronze statuette recovered from the harbour floor, a lamp, a fragment of decorated terracotta. These objects are not glamorous in the way that treasure is glamorous, but they are intimate in a way that monumental architecture cannot be, and they carry, in their particularity, something of the texture of the world that produced them. The scale of what lies underwater is genuinely difficult to grasp without direct experience of it, and the challenge it presents to archaeology is correspondingly difficult to convey in abstract terms. Consider what it means to excavate underwater. You cannot use the most fundamental tools of terrestrial archaeology, the careful removal of soil layer by layer with a trowel, the recording of every context in relation to every other context, the stratigraphic reading of a site that tells you not just what is there, but when it was deposited and in what relationship to everything around it. Underwater, you work in an environment where the act of moving disturbs your visibility, where currents redistribute sediment in ways you cannot always predict or control, where the physical effort of maintaining your position while attempting careful recording work drains your concentration and your air supply simultaneously, and where every day's work is subject to the kind of interruption from weather and water conditions that has no equivalent in terrestrial fieldwork. This is not to say that the underwater archaeology of Alexandria is not being done, or that it is not being done well. It is being done, and it is being done well, and the results have transformed what we know about the physical layout of the ancient city. But it is inherently slower, inherently more resource-intensive, and inherently more limited in scope than terrestrial archaeology, and the areas of the harbour that have been investigated represent a fraction of what may lie below the surface. One other factor that shapes the difficulty of the search, and that tends to get less attention than the geological and hydrological processes, is the deliberate human transformation of the city across the centuries following Cleopatra's death. Alexandria was, for the entirety of the Roman imperial period, a major and prosperous city, the second or third largest in the empire, depending on how you define the boundaries of Rome itself, and a major center of trade, scholarship, and religious life. Cities of that scale and duration do not preserve their earlier phases out of sentiment. They consume them. Buildings whose original function has been superseded are dismantled and their stone reused. Monumental structures whose political associations have become inconvenient are altered or demolished. The extraordinary marble and granite that had been used throughout the Ptolemaic royal quarter was, over the course of several centuries, progressively removed for use in Roman, Byzantine, and later Arab construction projects. A process so thorough that archaeologists working in Alexandria have found blocks and column shafts from Ptolemaic buildings incorporated into structures of much later date all over the city and the surrounding region. The Lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, survived into the medieval period before a series of earthquakes finally destroyed it, and its ruins were used in the 14th century as the foundation material for the fort of Kite Bay, which still stands on the promontory at the entrance to the eastern harbour. The blocks of the lighthouse are in the walls of the fort. This is what happened to the most celebrated structure in the ancient city. For a mausoleum of significant but not world historical importance, the fate was very likely similar or worse. The terrestrial portions of ancient Alexandria present a different but equally challenging set of problems. The modern city of Alexandria is one of Egypt's largest cities, with several million inhabitants, a functioning port, a university, a major road system, and all the infrastructure of a contemporary urban environment. It sits almost precisely on top of the ancient city. When construction projects in Alexandria dig below the surface, they frequently encounter ancient remains, and Egyptian law requires that such encounters be reported to the relevant authorities and assessed before work can continue. This system functions imperfectly, as it does in virtually every city with a significant ancient history underneath its modern foundations, but it has produced a steady stream of incidental discoveries over the decades. Objects and structures that give archaeologists brief windows into what lies below the streets and buildings of the modern city before the construction resumes and the window closes again. What has not been found in any of these windows or in any of the deliberate excavations that have been conducted in the terrestrial portions of the ancient city is a tomb complex of the scale and significance that the ancient sources lead us to expect from Cleopatra's mausoleum. The royal necropolis of the Ptolemies was, by ancient accounts, a substantial complex located in the eastern part of the royal quarter, and while various ancient tombs have been found in Alexandria over the centuries, none has been identified with confidence as part of the Ptolemaic royal burial complex. The question of whether this is because the complex has not been excavated, because it has been excavated without being recognized, because it was destroyed or substantially altered in the centuries following the Roman takeover, or because the ancient descriptions of its location are less precise than they appear, is one that cannot currently be answered with any confidence. The ancient writers who mention the tomb do so in terms that imply familiarity, in the way that a person writing for an audience that can verify what they are saying implies familiarity. Strabo, visiting Alexandria around 25 BC, roughly 5 years after Cleopatra's death, described the royal quarter and its components with a confidence that suggests he was working from direct observation or from very recent accounts. He mentions the Sema, the tomb complex that held Alexander the Great's body and the bodies of the Ptolemaic rulers, and places it in the royal quarter. Whether Cleopatra's mausoleum was part of this complex or adjacent to it or separate from it is not entirely clear from his account, but the implication is that it was within the same general area of the city, the eastern promontory facing the Great Harbour, and that its existence was a known and acknowledged fact about the urban landscape of Alexandria in the Augustan era. The problem is not that no one described where it was. The problem is that everything they described it in relation to has also disappeared. What can be said is that the combination of urban overlay, geological subsidence, and the sheer complexity of a site that has been continuously occupied for well over 2,000 years makes Alexandria one of the most challenging archaeological environments in the world, and that the specific object of the search adds another layer of difficulty on top of all of these. If Cleopatra's tomb were a large, distinctive monument of the kind that survives obviously above ground, like the pyramids or the temples of Upper Egypt, the search would long since have ended in discovery. But the ancient sources do not describe it as a monument of that kind. They describe it as a mausoleum, a burial building which in the Ptolemaic tradition would have been substantial but not necessarily visible from a distance or distinguishable from other substantial stone buildings in the royal quarter. In a city where many substantial stone buildings have been demolished, submerged, built over, or simply lost, a mausoleum is not inherently easier to find than anything else. The city had not been destroyed so much as translated, moved from one medium to another, from air to water, from access to inaccessibility, in a series of earthquakes and floods across roughly 1,000 years that no single generation fully registered as they were happening. What had been the most brilliant city in the ancient world was now distributed across 3 dimensions, some of it on the surface, some of it underground, and some of it beneath the harbour. And the problem of finding anything specific within it was the problem of reading a book that had been torn apart and scattered across a large room in the dark. And that is where we leave Alexandria. The city distributed across its 3 dimensions, part above ground, and part below and part beneath the water of the harbour. The problem of finding anything specific within it. The problem of reading a scattered book in the dark. We can move away from the city now, along the coast to the west, to a different site and a different kind of search. One that takes place not underwater and not beneath a functioning modern city, but in the open desert at the edge of the sea. The question that drives the search at this second location is the same question that drives the search in the harbour. But the circumstances are different, and the person who brought the question to this place arrived with a theory that most of her colleagues considered improbable and has spent 2 decades arguing for it, with a patience and persistence that the archaeology has, at least in part, begun to reward. Taposiris Magna sits on a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean coast and a large salt lake called Lake Mariot, roughly 50 kilometres west of Alexandria, along the road that runs parallel to the sea. The name means something like Great Osiris, and the site was a significant religious centre in the Ptolemaic period, home to a substantial temple dedicated to Osiris and his consort Isis that drew pilgrims from across the region and served as a place of cult practice for some of the most important religious traditions in the ancient Egyptian world. The temple complex is partially preserved above ground, its enclosure walls still standing to a considerable height in some sections. The stone course is weathered and pale in the coastal light, and the surrounding terrain is flat and open in a way that Alexandria's urban overlay makes impossible, which means that archaeological work here can proceed by more conventional methods, and at a larger scale than anything the city permits. Kathleen Martinez arrived at Taposiris Magna for the first time in the early years of the 21st century, standing at the edge of the temple precinct and looking at a site that most of the archaeological establishment had passed over, considered, and set aside. The conventional wisdom about Cleopatra's tomb was that it had been in Alexandria, in or near the royal quarter, and that the geological and urban transformation of the city had either destroyed it entirely or buried it beyond any practical hope of recovery. Martinez did not accept this conclusion. She had been thinking about the problem for years before she arrived at the site, reading the ancient sources with the attention of someone who was looking not for the answers the texts explicitly provided, but for the questions the texts implicitly raised. And she had arrived at a hypothesis that she found compelling enough to stake a significant portion of her professional life on. Her argument was grounded in several interlocking observations about Cleopatra's religious practice, political strategy, and the specific circumstances of her death. The first was the identification of Cleopatra with the goddess Isis, which was not merely a matter of symbolic association, but a central element of her claim to legitimate authority in Egypt. Cleopatra had cultivated this identification throughout her reign, appearing in the iconography of Isis in formal religious contexts, styling herself as the goddess incarnate in a tradition that had deep roots in Egyptian royal theology and that carried specific implications about the relationship between the ruler and the divine. The goddess Isis was associated above all with resurrection, with the restoration of the dead, with the capacity to find and reconstitute what had been lost, and the cult center of Isis in the Ptolemaic period was not confined to Alexandria, but was distributed across a network of temple sites along the Mediterranean coast. Taposiris Magna was one of those sites. More specifically, Martinez argued, it was a site associated with the legend of Osiris in a way that made it religiously significant in a manner that Alexandria, for all its grandeur, could not replicate. The myth of Osiris and Isis tells the story of a murdered god whose body was scattered and whose consort reassembled him, performing the first act of mummification and securing the possibility of resurrection. The site of this mythological reassembly, the place where Osiris was restored, was in some versions of the legend associated with the western edge of the Nile Delta, close to the stretch of coast where Taposiris Magna stands. If Cleopatra had identified herself with Isis deeply enough to shape her choice of burial location, then the site of Osiris's resurrection had a claim on her attention that few other places could match. The second strand of Martinez's argument involved the political logic of Cleopatra's situation in her final weeks. Octavian was in Alexandria. He had captured Cleopatra there and intended to hold her there. If Cleopatra managed to die before he could move her, as she did, the question of where her body would be buried involved a negotiation between what she had arranged for in advance and what Octavian was willing to permit. A burial within Alexandria itself, within what was now the Roman-controlled city, put the tomb in a location that Octavian could monitor, access, and ultimately control. A burial at a site outside the city, at a religious complex on the coast that had its own institutional weight and its own community of priests and devotees, offered a different kind of security. It was further from the center of Roman power. It was embedded in a religious tradition that Roman authority was, at least in this period, generally inclined to accommodate rather than suppress. And it was associated with exactly the goddess with whom Cleopatra had most publicly and persistently identified herself throughout her reign. There is a third strand to Martinez's case, less about religious symbolism or political strategy, and more about the specific topography of the site and its relationship to the broader geography of Cleopatra's world. Taposiris Magna was not a remote or obscure location. It sat on the main coastal road running west from Alexandria, the road that connected the city to the Libyan interior and to the trading networks that ran along the North African coast, and it was a place that people from Alexandria would have passed through regularly and known well. The temple complex was visible from the sea and served as a navigational landmark for ships approaching from the west. It was also, crucially, accessible, close enough to Alexandria to be reached in a day's journey, but far enough to be meaningfully outside the city's administrative and political gravitational field. For a burial that needed to be simultaneously accessible for the ritual requirements of the Egyptian religious tradition and removed from the direct oversight of the Roman administration, now occupying the palace quarter of Alexandria, the location had a practical logic that the purely symbolic arguments do not capture on their own. These arguments are not proof. Martinez has always been careful to present them as a hypothesis, a reading of the evidence that justifies extensive excavation, rather than a conclusion that the excavation is designed to confirm. The hypothesis is contested by other scholars who find the conventional Alexandria-based theory more persuasive, who argue that the sources place the tomb clearly enough within the city's royal quarter and that the identification with Taposiris Magna involves a degree of inference that goes beyond what the evidence can support. The debate is a genuine scholarly argument between people who know the material well, and the position that Taposiris Magna is the most likely location of Cleopatra's tomb is not a consensus view. What it is a serious view, held by a serious scholar with a serious program of excavation behind it, and the excavation has produced enough of interest to keep the argument alive and the work continuing. The finds at Taposiris Magna began accumulating from the early years of Martinez's work on the site and have continued across 2 decades of excavation. Coins bearing the image of Cleopatra were found in the vicinity of the temple complex, which is not in itself remarkable, since Cleopatra coins circulated widely across the region in the Ptolemaic period, but which contributes to the general picture of the site's significance in the period of her reign. Statues and fragments of statuary were recovered that indicate a high level of artistic and religious activity at the site in the 1st century BC. A series of tombs was found within the temple enclosure, cut into the rock below the temple precinct, which is not common at Egyptian temple sites, and which suggests that the site had a funerary significance beyond its role as a place of cult practice. The site does not give up its information easily. It takes years of careful work, season by season, to build a picture of what Taposiris Magna was, and when it was used and by whom. And the picture that is emerging is one of a complex and layered site, whose full significance is still being assessed. The temple itself, the enclosure walls, the lighthouse-like tower at the site's northern edge that mirrors the famous lighthouse of Alexandria in miniature. All of these are being mapped and documented with a precision that earlier work on the site did not achieve. What the map reveals as it fills in is a site that was more densely occupied and more intensively used in the Ptolemaic period than had previously been understood. The burial shafts and tombs within the enclosure are among the most discussed elements of the Taposiris Magna findings. They are cut into the limestone bedrock below the temple in the manner consistent with high-status Ptolemaic burial practice, and several of them contained objects and skeletal remains that indicate they were in use in the relevant period. None of them has been identified as the tomb of Cleopatra or of Antony, but their presence demonstrates that the site was being used for significant burials by people of sufficient status to be buried within a major temple enclosure at a time that corresponds to the final decades of Ptolemaic rule. The question of who is buried in those shafts is one that the excavation has not yet resolved. The remains recovered from several of the tombs have been studied, and the studies have produced information about the individuals interred, their age and sex, and in some cases their general health, but nothing that allows a specific identification. This is frustratingly typical of ancient Egyptian archaeology. The physical remains survive, the material culture survives, But the connection between the anonymous bones and the named people of the historical record is almost always impossible to establish without a written inscription or another form of direct identification. And at Taposiris Magna, the inscriptional evidence is sparse. The site at dusk, when the excavators have stopped work and the equipment has been covered and the day's finds have been logged and stored, has a particular quality of stillness that the middle of the day does not have. The light comes in low off the water, and the temple walls catch it and hold it for a moment before it goes. The desert behind the site is already dark. Zahi Hawass, the former head of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities and the country's most publicly prominent archaeologist, became involved in the Taposiris Magna excavations in the late 2000s and early 2010s, and the involvement of a figure of his visibility brought additional resources and additional international attention to the site. Hawass has been publicly skeptical of Martinez's central hypothesis at various points, while also participating in the excavations that her work made possible, a combination that reflects the genuinely complicated relationship between the hypothesis and the fieldwork. The fieldwork is valuable, regardless of whether the hypothesis proves correct. The tomb of Cleopatra may not be at Taposiris Magna, but the site is clearly significant in the Ptolemaic period and clearly warrants the excavation that has been devoted to it. The debate between the Alexandria hypothesis and the Taposiris Magna hypothesis is not merely a disagreement about one tomb's location. It is a disagreement about how to read Cleopatra's intentions in the last weeks of her life, about how much weight to give the symbolic dimensions of her choices versus their practical constraints, and about how to interpret ancient sources that are suggestive rather than definitive on almost every point that matters. Scholars who favor the Alexandria location tend to give more weight to the literary sources that describe the tomb as being in the royal quarter and to the evidence that Cleopatra had been building her mausoleum there before Actium, within the city she had ruled, near the temples and palaces that defined her authority. Scholars who find Taposiris Magna more persuasive tend to give more weight to the religious logic of the site and to the argument that a burial outside Octavian's immediate reach was both strategically sensible and symbolically appropriate for a queen who had spent her entire reign presenting herself as the living incarnation of Isis. Both positions have their weaknesses. The Alexandria position has to account for the fact that no trace of the royal mausoleum has been found in the city, despite a century of archaeological work and continuous modern construction. The Taposiris position has to account for the fact that the ancient sources do not explicitly place the tomb there, and that the identification relies on a chain of inference that some scholars consider longer than the evidence can support. Neither position can be definitively ruled out with the information currently available, and neither can be confirmed. It is worth sitting for a moment with what the search at Taposiris Magna actually looks like on the ground, in practice. Not the dramatic version. The moment of discovery. The brush revealing something gold in the lamplight. The actual daily texture of it, which is slower and more uncertain and more dependent on accumulated judgment than any single moment of revelation. Archaeological excavation is among the slowest forms of human inquiry. A single season of fieldwork at a site of this size and complexity might involve dozens of people working for several months and might produce a handful of new finds and a substantial body of contextual information that takes years to fully analyze and publish. The progress of the excavation is measured not in dramatic discoveries, but in the gradual accumulation of evidence, the slow filling in of what the site was and what it contained, and how those contents relate to the questions the excavation was designed to ask. Most days of fieldwork produce no headline finds. They produce data, careful and hard-won data that adds to the picture of the site without transforming it. The excavation at Taposiris Magna has been running, with interruptions for funding and for political circumstances, including a period of disruption following the Egyptian Revolution of 2011 for more than 20 years. In that time, it has produced a substantial body of new information about the site's use in the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, has uncovered tombs and objects and architectural features that were not previously known, and has made the case, which was initially treated with considerable skepticism, that Taposiris Magna deserves to be taken seriously as a possible location for the most sought-after missing tomb in the ancient world. What it has not produced is the tomb itself. It has produced evidence that the search is in the right general vicinity. Whether the right general vicinity is close enough is something that only the next excavation season can determine. Martinez had found coins, statues, burial shafts, evidence of a significant and deliberately organized sacred precinct at a site that sat on the road between Alexandria and Cleopatra's world. Whether the tomb was there remained unproven, but what she had established, against the weight of initial skepticism, was that Taposiris Magna was a serious candidate. Serious enough to keep digging, serious enough to keep the question open, and serious enough to suggest that the absence of Cleopatra's tomb was not evidence that she had simply vanished, but evidence that the search had not yet reached the right place. And that is where we leave the searchers and their arguments, the excavation at the end of its working day, the light going off the temple walls, the question still open in the way it has always been open. We can step back now from the specifics of the archaeological debate, from the competing claims of Alexandria and Taposiris Magna, and the accumulated evidence of 20 years of fieldwork that has produced so much and still not produced the thing it was looking for. What remains is not the archaeology, but the absence itself, and the question of what the absence means and what it would mean if it ended. The excavation tunnels at Taposiris Magna in the last hour of daylight have a quality that the bright heat of the working day does not. The electric lights strung along the ceiling of the main tunnel cast the brushed stone in amber, giving the cut limestone walls the color of old bone. And the Egyptian excavators working at the far end of the tunnel move with the unhurried concentration of people doing careful work in a confined space, their brushes and small picks making sounds that carry clearly in the enclosed air. The sealed doorway at the tunnel's end has been the subject of careful attention for several weeks. Behind it, or possibly behind it, is a space that has not been entered since it was closed. And the closing is old enough that the stone around the threshold has settled and shifted slightly with the weight of the centuries above it. It may be nothing. It may be a storage room. It may be a tomb of someone whose name was not Cleopatra, and whose presence here would add another small piece to the picture of what the site was, without resolving the question that brought the excavation here in the first place. Or it may be something else. The weight of not knowing is not evenly distributed across history. There are absences that feel neutral, gaps in the record that we register without particular distress, because the missing information does not carry sufficient emotional or symbolic freight to make its absence pressing. And then there are absences like this one, absences that have been felt for so long and by so many people, across so many generations and cultural contexts, that the not knowing has acquired its own kind of presence, its own outline in the shape of the questions that surround it. Cleopatra's missing tomb is one of those absences. It has been generating inquiry and speculation since within living memory of her death, and the inquiry and speculation have not diminished over 2 millennia so much as they have accumulated, layer on layer, each generation adding its own interpretation of the absence to the ones already there. The question of what finding Cleopatra's tomb would actually mean is one that archaeologists and historians have thought about carefully, because the expectation that surrounds the search is so large and so culturally loaded that the reality of any discovery, if it comes, will almost certainly be more complicated and more ambiguous than the expectation allows for. A tomb does not speak, it holds objects and remains, and the objects and remains require interpretation, and the interpretation requires context, and the context has been partially destroyed or lost or submerged, and the gap between what the tomb would physically contain and what people would want the tomb to reveal is likely to be very wide indeed. What would be in the tomb if it is found? Human remains, almost certainly degraded by 2,000 years of time and conditions. Objects, jewelry, possibly, or the residue of jewelry. Containers for offerings, the kind of grave goods that Egyptian funerary practice prescribed for a burial of royal status in the Ptolemaic period. An inscription, perhaps, if the tomb was marked with a text in the usual manner. Though inscriptions can be damaged or removed or misread or deliberately obscured, and their presence is not guaranteed, and their clarity, if they exist, is not guaranteed either. The physical person of Cleopatra, the specific woman who spoke 9 languages and negotiated with Rome and chose the manner of her own death, is not in the tomb in any way that can be recovered. What is there is the shell of what was there, the material residue of a burial that took place more than 2,000 years ago, and interpreting that residue in relation to the enormously complex historical figure to whom it belonged is a task that would take decades and would not produce certainty at the end of them. This is not an argument against the search. It is an argument for understanding what the search is actually for and what finding its object would and would not resolve. The myth problem is real and it is worth naming directly. Cleopatra is not, at this point, primarily a historical figure for most of the people in the world who know her name. She's a cultural archetype, a symbol, a vessel into which successive generations have poured their own concerns and fantasies and interpretations, and the historical woman, the politician and linguist and religious performer and military strategist who actually lived in Alexandria in the 1st century before the Common Era, has been substantially obscured by the accumulated weight of all this subsequent projection. The Roman writers who created the earliest influential accounts of her had their own political reasons for presenting her as a seductress whose hold over Caesar and Antony was primarily sexual and whose ambitions were dangerous to Roman virtue. The Renaissance writers who picked up those accounts added their own elaborations. Shakespeare's version of her, magnificent and inexhaustible as a piece of theatre, is Shakespeare's invention as much as it is history. The film versions are something else again. By the time we reach the present, the word Cleopatra calls up an image that has almost nothing to do with the woman who learned 9 languages and stood on the deck of a retreating fleet in 31 BC and understood, with the clarity of a very precise mind, exactly how bad things were. What finding the tomb would resolve, with a degree of finality that no amount of literary analysis can provide, is the question of location. We would know where she is. After 2,000 years of not knowing, that knowledge would have a weight that is difficult to overstate. Even if it told us nothing else, it would give the story a place to stand, a specific piece of ground that could be pointed to and said, here, it was here, in this room, on this floor, under this ceiling that has been holding up its weight of earth since the mourners sealed it and walked away. The abstractness of the absence would resolve into the concreteness of a room, and the room would be real, and the reality of it would do something to the story that the story has been waiting for 2,000 years to have done to it. There is also the question of what the tomb would tell us about Cleopatra that the literary sources do not. Burial practice in the ancient world was not arbitrary. The choices made in preparing a tomb and conducting a burial were meaningful, and the meanings they carried were specific to the cultural and religious context in which they were made. If Cleopatra was buried in the Egyptian minaret, with Egyptian funerary objects and Egyptian religious iconography, that tells us something about how she understood herself and how she wished to be understood after death. Something that the literary sources, most of which were written from a Greek or Roman perspective and within a Greek or Roman literary tradition, cannot fully convey. If she was buried with the objects that Egyptian royal theology prescribed for the journey through the underworld, the texts and the vessels and the carefully prepared body that the tradition required, then the tomb is not merely a location, but a document. A physical statement about who she considered herself to be in the world and beyond it. The question of which world she considered herself to belong to was one that followed her throughout her life. She was Greek by origin, and Egyptian by vocation, and Roman by political necessity, and she navigated the intersections of these three worlds with a skill that none of her contemporaries, as far as the record shows, fully appreciated in the moment, though the scale of the effort she made can be read clearly enough in retrospect. The identification with Isis was not purely cynical, any more than her learning of Egyptian was purely strategic. These were, or became over time, genuine commitments to a tradition that was not the tradition of her birth, made by a woman who had decided that being the Queen of Egypt meant actually being Egyptian in some way that the previous Ptolemies had never dried. Whether that commitment extended to shaping the circumstances of her death and the location of her burial in the same terms is something only the tomb can confirm. The absence has its own long history. For roughly 2 centuries after her death, Alexandria continued to exist as a major city in which the memory of the Ptolemaic period was still alive, in which people had living family connections to those who had known the court, in which the tomb's location may have been known to some even as its public accessibility diminished. At some point in those first 2 centuries, the practical knowledge of where the tomb was began to pass out of living memory, or was deliberately suppressed, or became irrelevant to a community that had moved on to other concerns, and the tomb passed from the category of known but inaccessible into the category of lost. The precise moment of that transition, the point at which the last person who knew where it was died without passing the knowledge on, is not recorded and cannot be recovered. It happened. The thread broke. There is a particular pathos in that transition, the moment when knowledge becomes loss, when something that was known and could in principle have been preserved became something that was gone and could not be recovered without extraordinary effort or extraordinary luck. The pathos is not primarily about Cleopatra, who was beyond caring where her body lay by the time the knowledge began to fade. It is about the information itself, about the way that practical knowledge of specific things, the kind of knowledge that lives in the memories of particular people and in the routines of particular communities, is so much more fragile than the monuments and the texts that it surrounded. So much easier to lose without anyone noticing that it is going until it has already gone. The library at Alexandria burned, or was allowed to decay, or dispersed gradually over centuries, depending on which version of the story you follow. And the loss of the text it contained is the famous loss, the one that people have mourned and discussed for 2,000 years. But the library was also full of practical knowledge knowledge about where things were and how they worked and who maintained them, and that knowledge, being practical rather than textual, left no trace at all when it went. Once broken, the thread could only be approached from the other end, the end of not knowing, working backward through inference and evidence toward a location that might or might not be discoverable. Every scholar who has worked on the question of Cleopatra's tomb has been working from this end, and every scholar has hit the same problem. The evidence is consistent with several possible locations, and none of the possible locations can be definitively ruled out or definitively confirmed without the kind of direct physical investigation that the circumstances of each location make very difficult. 2t. The search continues because the question is answerable in principle. The search continues because the answer is still out there, somewhere in the ground or under the water, waiting. The sealed door at the end of the tunnel, the light touching the brushed stone, the quiet of the site at the end of the working day, when the excavators have packed their tools and the stillness has returned to what was there before they came. Finding the tomb would answer one question and open 100 others. It would not return Cleopatra to us in any complete sense, because what was buried was a body, not a life, and the life had already been so thoroughly worked over by Roman propaganda and Renaissance theatre and Hollywood and the accumulated weight of 20 centuries of projection that recovering the actual person behind all of it would require more than an archaeologist's brush. But the tomb would be something. It would be the ground asserting, after all this time, that she was real, that she was here, that she died in a specific place and was laid in a specific room, and that the room is still there, waiting as it has always been, just beneath the surface of whatever the present happens to be standing on. And that is where the search sits, at this moment, in this particular season of the excavation. The answer still ahead of the question, the door at the end of the tunnel, not yet opened. We have followed this story as far as it currently goes, from the harbour at Alexandria in 31 BC to the tunnels at Taposiris Magna in the present day, from the last fleet returning from Actium to the electric lights strung along cut limestone ceilings, and what we arrive at is not a resolution but a threshold, the edge of what is known and the beginning of what the ground has not yet given back. Let us come back now to where we started. The shore is the same shore it has always been, give or take the slow adjustments of 2,000 years of geological time, and the sea arrives at it with the same indifference it has always brought to human history, carrying whatever the tide carries, depositing it at the waterline, withdrawing, returning, somewhere not far from where the water touches the ruins, or perhaps somewhat further along the coast at a temple precinct that a Bolivian archaeologist has been excavating for 20 years, with a conviction that has outlasted most of the skepticism directed at it. A queen who died at 39 is still waiting to be found. The light is coming up now. The darkness that was there when we arrived is giving way, very slowly, to the grey that precedes the actual sunrise, and the shapes of the half-buried walls are becoming more distinct against the lightening sky, their outlines sharpening from the vague suggestions they were an hour ago into something more legible, more clearly the remnants of human construction rather than simply lumps in the style terrain. The sea is still the same color. The smell of salt and limestone and that older thing that has no name is still the same. Nothing has changed. Everything that was here before the light came is still here after it. What changes with the light is not the place but what you can see of it. The question of where Cleopatra is buried has been asked in the dark for 2,000 years, without the right kind of light falling on it. The light is still not quite there, but it is coming. The horizon is brighter than it was an hour ago. The water catching the first real color of the day, and the ruins along the shore are becoming, slowly and definitely, more visible, more knowable. The shapes of what was there are clarifying inch by inch, year by year, season by careful and patient season, in the way that all good archaeological knowledge clarifies, gradually, without drama, one careful brushstroke at a time. What happened in this stretch of coast in the century before and the year of 30 BC was too large and too specifically documented and too thoroughly embedded in the cultural inheritance of the Western world to simply disappear entirely into the absence of a single unlocated room. The absence will end, or it will not, but either way the search for it has been and continues to be worth making. The room is waiting. What changes with the light is not the place, but what you can see of it. This is true of the coast, and it is true of the story that belongs to it. What 2,000 years of sustained human attention has changed is not the fact of Cleopatra's absence, but the resolution with which the absence can be examined, the precision with which the question of her burial location can be asked, the range of possible answers that the evidence is now sufficient to rule out. We have not found her, but we have narrowed the search in ways that would have been impossible a century ago, and inconceivable 2 centuries before that. And the narrowing continues, season by season, methodically, with the patience that this kind of inquiry requires. The name has never faded. This is worth noting, as the light comes up over the water and the birds begin their work along the shoreline. The name Cleopatra has been in continuous circulation since she was alive, has never experienced the eclipse that claims most historical figures within a few generations of their death, has persisted across the entire span of Western cultural history as a reference point that everyone recognizes and almost no one can fully account for. She is in Shakespeare, and she is in ancient Rome, and she is in Hollywood, and she is in the academic journals published last year. And the thread connecting all of these is real, even if it has been stretched and reinterpreted and sometimes very nearly severed. Something of the actual woman survives in all of that, even through the thick overlay of projection and myth. Something of the specific intelligence and the specific political will and the specific quality of attention she brought to the world she inhabited can be discerned, if you look carefully enough, in the way the sources describe her, even when the sources are trying to diminish her. The Roman sources are trying to diminish her. The Roman sources tried hardest. Octavian's Rome needed her to be a foreign seductress, a dangerous Eastern queen who had bewitched 2 of Rome's greatest men and led them away from Roman virtue and into dissolution, because that story justified the war and explained the defeat and placed the blame for everything that had gone wrong with Antony on Antony's weakness rather than Octavian's ruthlessness. The story was useful, and it stuck because useful stories tend to stick, and because Cleopatra was not there to contradict it. She had died before she could be displayed in Rome, had denied Octavian the spectacle he wanted, and had left him with no recourse except to write the history himself, which he and his court poets and his historians proceeded to do with considerable skill. What they could not write away was the achievement. The Ptolemaic kingdom survived longer under Cleopatra than it had any right to survive, given the pressure Rome was applying to every adjacent territory throughout her reign. The coalition she built with Antony came closer to checking Octavian's expansion than anything else in the Eastern Mediterranean managed. The religious and political synthesis she enacted, the genuine identification with Egyptian tradition rather than the arm's-length Hellenistic management her predecessors had practiced, was sufficiently real and sufficiently respected that her statues survived in the city for generations after her death. These are not the accomplishments of a ruler. The light is fully up now. The sea has gone from grey to blue. The ruins along the waterline are clear in the morning light, their pale stone dry and salt-washed, the spaces between them filled with sand that has shifted and resettled over many seasons. The birds that were working the shoreline in the dark are further off now, following the line of the water, indifferent to the old walls and the old question and the long patience of the ground. There is something appropriate about the fact that she has not been found in the place where she is most known. Alexandria is a city of several million people now, a busy Mediterranean port with a tram and a motorway and a new library, built in conscious echo of the old one. A city that acknowledges its ancient history in the way that cities do, with museums and plaques and a general civic pride in the magnitude of what came before, without necessarily carrying that history in any immediate or pressingly fell way. The ancient city is beneath the modern one, present in the occasional discovery when foundations are dug and in the careful work of the underwater archaeologists in the harbor, but not visible, not immediately inhabitable by the imagination in the way that a site like Taposiris Magna, open to the sky on its strip of coastal plain, is immediately inhabitable. Perhaps that is part of what the absence means, not that Cleopatra has been lost, but that she has not been enclosed, not been fixed in a location that makes her available to the kind of specific, located, geographically anchored memory that a tomb provides. She remains where she has always been, in the texts and the stories and the long argument about who she was and what she meant, distributed across the same kind of cultural territory that her city now occupies, present everywhere in general and nowhere in particular. The name has done something unusual in the long history of names. Most names from antiquity have a population. There are many Caesars in the historical record, many Ptolemies, many Antonis, and the name serves as a category rather than an individual. Cleopatra has remained for 2,000 years a name that points to a single person. When you say the name, there is no ambiguity about which Cleopatra you mean, even though there were many women by that name in the Ptolemaic family and in the broader ancient world. The singularity is not simply a function of her fame, though the fame is real enough. It is a function of the quality of her presence in the historical record, the density and vividness of the accounts that survive, the fact that she emerges from them as an individual rather than a type, a specific intelligence operating in specific circumstances with specific consequences. That specificity is what makes the absence of the tomb feel different from the absence of, say, the tomb of Alexander the Great, which is also lost and has also been the subject of sustained scholarly inquiry. Alexander's tomb is missing from an era of greater distance, the record thinner, the person already partly mythological by the time the earliest surviving accounts were written. Cleopatra is missing from an era of relative historical richness, from a period for which we have detailed and cross-referenced sources, from a life that was documented almost in real time by people who were contemporaries or near contemporaries and who had access to participants. The gap between the density of the historical record and the completeness of the physical absence is wider for her than for almost anyone else from the ancient world, and it is that gap that gives the search its particular quality of urgency. There is also the matter of what the tomb would mean for Egypt. The question of Cleopatra's burial location is, in one dimension, an international scholarly argument conducted in academic journals and conference papers and archaeological reports. In another dimension, it is an Egyptian question, a question about the last ruler of ancient Egypt, the last person to hold the title of pharaoh in any meaningful sense, the last figure who stood in a direct line of succession to the great tradition of Egyptian kingship that had been running, with interruptions, for 3,000 years before she died. The Egyptian archaeologists who work on the Taposiris Magna site are not merely colleagues of Kathleen Martinez in a neutral academic enterprise. They are working on a question about their own country's history, their own cultural inheritance, and the significance of finding the answer cannot be separated from that context. The relationship between the modern Egyptian state and the antiquities it holds is not simple. Egypt is one of the most archaeologically rich countries in the world, and the management of that richness, the questions of what gets excavated and how and by whom and with whose money and to whose benefit, are contested questions with real political and economic stakes. Foreign archaeologists working in Egypt operate within a framework of Egyptian oversight and Egyptian partnership that has become more robust over the decades, and the involvement of Egyptian scholars in projects like the Taposiris Magna excavation reflects both a shift in how international archaeology thinks about its responsibilities and a genuine Egyptian investment in the outcome of the work. If the tomb is found, it will be found in Egypt under Egyptian law, and the objects it contains will remain in Egypt. This is as it should be. The question of what it means to search for something you may never find is one that extends beyond archaeology into the general human relationship with the past and with the specific kind of attention that the past rewards. Searching for Cleopatra's tomb is not merely an act of archaeological inquiry. It is also an act of recognition, a way of insisting that the physical fact of her existence matters, that the specific place where her body was laid is worth knowing, that the 2,000-year gap between her death and the present day has not made the answer irrelevant. Every season of excavation at Taposiris Magna, every dive in the harbour at Alexandria, every consultation of the ancient sources looking for a clue that earlier readers may have overlooked, is a small argument against the idea that the past is finished, that its losses are final, that the thread once broken cannot be followed back. The argument is sometimes right and sometimes wrong. The library is gone. Alexander's tomb has not been found. Many things that existed once are beyond recovery. But the persistent attention to the specific and the particular, the refusal to let the absence settle into mere absence, is itself a form of faithfulness to the people who lived those lives and made those choices and died in those specific places. That the record has not preserved. It is the right kind of attention, even when it does not produce the result it is looking for. And Cleopatra, who spent her entire life paying exactly this kind of attention to the world around her, who understood better than almost anyone in her era that the specific details of a situation were the place where real understanding lived, would perhaps have appreciated the patience of the people looking for her, even if she might also have found it characteristic of the living that they were still arguing about where she was after all this time and could not simply go and check. The coast holds all of this with the same even-handedness it brings to everything. The questions that people carry to it, the old arguments and the new techniques and the careful brushwork in the tunnels, all of it lands on the same limestone and the same sand and the same sea that was here before any of it began. The light comes in off the water in the morning, the way it always has, striking the tops of the half-buried walls before it reaches the flat ground behind them. And for a few minutes the ruins are golden in a way that the midday light does not produce, a warmth that belongs to the specific angle of the early sun and to nothing else. And then the angle shifts, and the warmth is gone, and the stone is pale again, keeping its counsel. The search continues. It has always continued, through every generation since the last person who knew where the tomb was walked away from it. The season turns. The excavators will return. there is a particular kind of historical knowledge that only physical evidence can provide, and it is different in quality from the knowledge that texts provide, not better in all respects but different in a way that matters. The texts give us language and argument and intention and interpretation, the way people understood and described and contested what happened. The physical evidence gives us the fact of the thing itself. The object or the structure or the human remain that was once part of the living world and has survived into the present in some condition, however degraded, that allows it to be examined directly rather than through the filter of someone else's account. Both kinds of knowledge are necessary for understanding the past. Each is incomplete without the other. For Cleopatra, the textual knowledge is extensive, perhaps more extensive than for any other woman of the ancient world. The physical knowledge is, for the specific question of her burial, almost entirely absent. The tomb, if it is found, will not contradict the texts so much as it will complete them, filling in the material dimension of a life that is otherwise known almost entirely through what people wrote about it. It is worth thinking, in that context, about what it has meant for the past 2,000 years to have Cleopatra known only through language. Language is by its nature interpretive, always already shaped by the perspective and purpose of the person using it. The Roman language about Cleopatra was shaped by the political needs of the Augustan settlement. The medieval European language about her was shaped by the literary conventions of the period and by the specific moral frameworks those conventions carried. The modern language about her, even the academic language, is shaped by the questions that the present brings to the past, questions about women's power and representation, and the distorting effects of propaganda and the relationship between myth and history. Each era has found in Cleopatra what it was already looking for, which is both a testament to the richness of her story and a measure of how much the story has been overlaid with subsequent meaning. The tomb, silent and specific and stubbornly material, would not be subject to that kind of overlay in the same way. It would simply be what it is, and what it is would be, for the first time in 2,000 years, a physical fact about this woman rather than an interpretation of one. The morning has fully arrived. The light is no longer the gold of the early sun, but the brighter, flatter white of the day. And the sea has shifted from blue to a glittering hard brightness that makes it difficult to look at directly. The birds have moved further along the coast. The ruins are just ruins now, stone in the sun. The romance of the early hour worn off and replaced by the plain factuality of old walls in daylight, which is a different but no less real thing. The ground under your feet is the same ground it was an hour ago. The question it contains is the same question. The patience required to keep asking it is the same patience. The questions they are asking are still the right questions. The ground has not run out of answers. It has simply not yet been asked in the right way, in the right place, with the right combination of evidence and method and, perhaps, luck. The luck is not guaranteed. Nothing in archaeology is guaranteed. But the absence is not permanent either, and the people looking for the end of it are serious, and the tools they are using are better than any tools that have been applied to this question before. The coast is quiet in the early morning. The water touches the stone. The ruins hold their knowledge. They have been holding it for a long time, and they are in no hurry. And the patience they bring to the task is not the patience of indifference, but the patience of stone, which is simply what it is, present and dense, and there, in the particular place where it has always been, keeping whatever it keeps in the particular silence of old material, waiting to be asked the right question in the right WW, at the right time. The lantern in the tunnel throws a circle of light that moves when the person carrying it moves, and beyond the circle, there is the particular darkness of underground places. The darkness that has been there since the last time someone sealed the door and walked away. The excavators work slowly. That is the nature of the work. You brush the sand from the stone, and then you brush more sand from more stone, and gradually a surface emerges that has not had air on it in a very long time. There are rooms like this all along the Mediterranean coast, rooms that were sealed and forgotten, rooms whose doors are still closed, rooms that have been waiting in the dark with extraordinary patience for the person who finally opens them. Most of those rooms contain nothing that anyone would call significant. The sand fills them. The stone settles, but somewhere in one of these rooms, or in a chamber beneath the harbour floor, or beneath the foundations of a temple that has been standing in the Egyptian sun for 2,000 years and more, there is a room that is different from the others. Two people were placed there in the old way, with the old care. The door was sealed. The mourners left. The city continued above it, and then declined, and then was replaced by another city, which was also replaced, and through all of it the room held. She is in there. We do not know where in there means, but the ground does. The lantern moves deeper into the tunnel. The light touches the next stone. The brush sweeps carefully in the silence. Thank you for spending this night in the ruins with me, and with a queen whose tomb is still out there waiting. If this is the kind of company you like to keep, subscribing to the channel means the next story will find you when you are ready for it. There is always another mystery, another absence, another extraordinary life that the ground has not yet given back. Sleep well.